Okay, well, good noon, everybody. Joining all of us today here is Minnesota's very own Secretary of State, Steve Simon. He has very, very generously given us this opportunity to learn a bit more about his experiences in our government and his experiences throughout his life, and just so we can learn a bit more about our state officials. So yes, Mr. Secretary, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Well, to start off, I suppose most people here are probably wondering, what does a Secretary of State actually do?
Right, that's probably the first question. So we wear, in our office, we wear a few hats. I'd say three buckets of responsibilities, let's say. The first one has to do with businesses. So when you start a business in Minnesota, the very first thing you're going to want to do before you hire anyone, before you get an office, is you got to make the thing come alive from a legal standpoint. Mm-hmm. And you do that by filing certain papers with our office. And then after you're already an established business, there's a whole host of related kinds of filings and documents that you need to file. So we're kind of like the welcome mat for Minnesota businesses. So that's the first thing. The second thing is we run a program called the Safe at Home program. Safe at Home is an address confidentiality program for victims of domestic violence or stalking or sexual assault. It enables people in the program to keep their home address completely private and secret for all purposes. So nobody knows where they truly live except them and us, and I guess whoever they choose to tell. And it's really life-saving work. But there's no question that the bucket of responsibilities that gets the most attention, the most interest, the most scrutiny is the elections function. So we and I oversee the Minnesota election system, the whole thing. Here's what we don't do. We don't count votes, ever. The Secretary of State's office at the state, we don't count votes. That all happens in cities and in counties and in towns all over the state. We don't hire or train the people who work in the polling places. That also happens at the local level. So what do? Well, we certify all the elections equipment. We do all the legislative and policy level work at the Minnesota legislature and in Congress. We run the big databases that are kind of the spine of the system that keep track of who is an eligible voter and who isn't, who's registered and who's not. So I like to say that I and we are in the democracy business, and that's the part of the office that, as I say, gets the most attention and takes up the most time.
Absolutely. That's very, very important work, especially in these days. Well, I suppose my second question would be, as a Secretary of State, what does a typical day look like, and are you usually fairly busy?
I'm pretty busy, yeah, but you know, like any job, I mean anywhere, things can tend to be seasonal or cyclical. Some seasons are a busy season for certain kind of work, some not. Obviously, election season, election years are really, really busy for us because we're overseeing a lot. We're in constant contact, in constant touch with our partners, our teammates really at the local level, the counties, the cities, the townships. But then there are other parts of the year that are busy for other parts of the office or for other reasons. Right now, the thing that's taking up the most of my time personally has to do with the legislative session. So the Minnesota legislature just came back into session last week. A lot of new people after a new election, and we have a pretty ambitious legislative agenda in our office. We just rolled it out yesterday, as a matter of fact, and we're working with a lot of legislators to get that passed. So I spend a lot of my time, as do many of our staff members, meeting with legislators, helping to draft bills, meeting with partners from outside of government, outside of the office, coalition partners to try to get things passed. And sometimes it's offense and sometimes it's defense. Whenever you're working in a legislature, and I used to be in the Minnesota legislature, part of it is offense, meaning things you want passed, and part of it is defense, trying to stop things that you don't like, that you don't want to be passed. So it's a combination. Right. But right now, I would say that's what's keeping me the busiest.
Absolutely. I'm kind of curious, what is your favorite part about the job of being the Secretary of State?
Honestly, I think the favorite part of my job is getting out all over Minnesota. Honestly, visits like this, but not just this. You know, we have 87 counties in Minnesota. We're actually a big state when it comes to just real estate, just square footage, just size. And so I make it a priority, I have so far, to every year do an 87 county tour where I go and try to visit all 87 counties in Minnesota, which is kind of a jigsaw puzzle because there's a lot of them and they take a long time to get to. But I think it's important because in a job like this, I think the worst thing you could do, or anyone in this position could do, would be to sort of stay in a bubble in the Capitol or in St. Paul and not get out there and talk to people and learn from people. And so what I love doing is getting out on the road and talking to people, whether it's in the business area or safe at home or elections or something else, and hearing their concerns, learning from them, listening. I really have discovered that the best ideas come from all over Minnesota. There are things we do in our office that we picked up on because someone made a comment or someone had an idea. And it could be in a far-flung part of the state. But I think it's really important for the office. But not only that, just fun to get out there on the road and meet with people and experience different things throughout the state.
So that whole sort of thing of going out, being engaged, and just involving the state that you're representing.
Yeah, I think that's important. Like I say, you know, we're all a captive of our own bubbles, right? It's just a natural thing in life. We tend to self-sort a little bit. We hang out with people who are like us in whatever ways that means. That could mean you go to the same school. It could mean you live in the same place. It could mean a lot of ways. And I think, and that's not a bad thing, but sometimes I think we have to be conscious of that we're all, everyone, I think naturally, is in our own bubble and being conscious of trying to get outside of your bubble.
Right.
And I think that's important for anyone.
Absolutely, absolutely. I know that you were saying you're working on the whole legislative agenda for the state in the upcoming years. But I'd like to know, what are some of the challenges that you face while having to deal with people on the other side of the aisle? How do you work out those conflicts?
Well, that's interesting that you mentioned the other side of the aisle. So like I said, I was in the Minnesota legislature. So I served in the Minnesota House for 10 years, representing Hopkins and St. Louis Park, which is where I grew up, where I still live. And you learn really quickly when you're in a legislative body that you really do have to try to find common ground. You're not always going to agree. That would be naive to think, oh, we're always going to agree and come to some unanimous position. Of course not. That's naive. But you do learn that maybe your ally one day or your adversary one day will be an ally the next day. Sure, you might be opposing each other on this particular issue or piece of legislation or whatever, but don't burn that bridge, because next week, next month, next year, you might find yourself in a position where you got to work together with that person. Don't say anything or do anything that's going to completely alienate you from that person if you can avoid it. You can be passionate about your stand or your view on things, so that's important. So I'd like to think that I preserved and created some good relationships across the aisle, as you say. For those who don't know what that term means, it means, you know, with people who are from a different political party usually, or a different point of view. I think that's important. People say it a lot, I'll say it again, I suppose, like you can disagree without being disagreeable. You know
Absolutely.
what I mean? It's okay to say, I think you're dead wrong, without just totally going nuclear on the person and attacking them or their character. You can say, I think you're wrong, I think your approach is wrong, I think your bill is a bad idea. That's okay. You make it about the issue, don't make it about the person. And I think if you can avoid that, anyone in this situation can go far and get some good things done. So I try to live by that.
So I know that, you were mentioning that you do a lot of work in the election sphere and everything, but what are the greatest threats to democracy in Minnesota right now, especially with things happening in recent years?
Yeah, I think the number one threat to democracy is what I'll call disinformation, which is, when I really think about it, kind of a fancy word for lies. And here's what I mean. Like I said before, reasonable people can disagree on policy issues, including on election policy issues. There are reasonable, smart, patriotic, honest, ethical people, maybe in this room, but certainly in this state and in this country, who disagree with me on elections policy. That doesn't make them dishonest or unpatriotic because they disagree with me. So let's have that out. Let's have the debate all day long about what our election system should look like, what it ought to be, what laws we should add, what laws we should subtract, how we should do things differently. That's totally fair game. I would never say someone who disagrees with me is engaged in disinformation. But we've seen in recent years this sort of distortion of the facts on elections issues to serve a particular political agenda or outcome,
Right.
when things just are not so. They are not true. And so if we can't come to a agreement or consensus about what the system is, forget for a minute, put on a shelf for a minute this business of what it ought to be, then we're in trouble. And at its most extreme, we see things like the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol in 2021. When people take that disinformation, that false information, and they act on it in a violent way, not everyone's going to act in that way. That's why I say that's the most extreme outcome. But it's a problem when you have people saying without basis and without evidence that our elections are rigged or fixed or stolen. That is not true. I'm not an expert in most of the rest of the country, but I do know a thing or two about Minnesota election laws, and that is just not true. It would be super, super hard to rig an election in Minnesota. Thousands of people would have to be in on the plot and in on the conspiracy, and that has not happened, nor will it. But we just have to get to a place where we can disagree on what the system should be, but agree on what we have in place to make that a very remote possibility. And we've seen, January 6th is the obvious example, and it is an extreme one. It's not the normal reaction. But at its worst, that's what that kind of thing can lead to.
Absolutely.
And I do worry about that a lot. And I think that's really a national problem, and unfortunately, Minnesota is not immune to that.
Do you think with polarization continuing in a lot of division, do you think something like January 6th could have ever, or could in the future, happen in Minnesota?
In Minnesota, anything is possible. I'd like to think that Minnesota is, above average in many, many ways, and that's one of them. Typically, that kind of thing. This has not been a state that's been fertile ground for that kind of thing. But there are other less toxic forms of disinformation, still toxic, short of people killing each other, that I do worry about. And so, we just got to be on guard. And again, I'm not looking to say bad things about people who just disagree with me. That's democracy. That's not disinformation.
Right.
But when you're peddling stuff intentionally and it's designed to undermine confidence in the system, that is well-earned confidence. We have very fair and accurate and honest and secure elections in Minnesota, whether Democrats are in charge or Republicans. That's been the case for many decades. Is it perfect? No, never. But some of the charges that have been leveled and the things that people have said are just plain false. They're made up, and that can be a poisonous thing as people start to believe that stuff and then turn away from democracy, turn away from voting because they're convinced something is rigged or fixed or stolen, when it's not.
I kind of want to know a bit more about your background and who you are. So what really influenced your decision to get in a political career?
If I had to trace it back, I would say when I was a kid, like a little kid, like elementary school, I was into current events, and nobody pushed it. My parents didn't ask me to or make me read a newspaper or anything like that. But my parents, when I grew up, had two news sources lying around the house: the Minneapolis Star-Tribune newspaper and Time magazine. Those were the two, and they were kind of just lying around. They didn't push it. They didn't say, go eat your vegetables and read Time magazine or anything like that. It was just lying around. And so I would, walk by the newspaper or magazine and I'd see a headline, whether it was a sports score or a war or a famine or an election or whatever. And I started to get just sort of curious, like, okay, that's what's happening in the world. There was nothing political about it, just, okay, cool, all right, this is a news source telling me what's happening in the state or the country or the world. And then over time, I started to draw nearer to that stuff. And the leap to the political part, at least for me, was over time when you just are exposed to just headlines about stuff, it seemed natural to me at least, that I would start to develop a rooting interest in the outcome, right? So, by the time I was most of your age in junior high, middle school, high school, I started thinking, okay, here are all these headlines I'm walking by and glancing at and taking an interest in. What do I wish the headline would be tomorrow? Or next week, or next month. And so that seemed natural to me. It's sort of like if you met someone who watched 20 baseball games on TV per week, it would seem weird to me if you asked them, oh, wow, you're really into baseball. What's your favorite team? And they said, oh, I don't have one. And you said, but you watch all this baseball. Don't you care about who wins? No, I watch all the games. I don't care at all who wins any of them. I just like to watch a lot of baseball. That would seem really odd to me. So when I was taking all this in and starting to, watch the news and figure it out, it seemed natural to me that over time I would I would sort of reorient and think, okay, what do I want the headline to be? Who do I want to win that war? Who do I want to win that game? What do I wish the economy looked like, or schools, or whatever it was? Maybe not that detailed at that time, but the general idea. And that, to me at least, led to an attraction to political campaigns, because electing people to office is a very good way to help get those outcomes that you want. It's not the only way, but it's a pretty good way. And so that led to an involvement in political campaigns and the like.
And so that sort of fascination drove you to get involved, almost actually to the point where you became involved in it yourself. I suppose with campaigns, what are your most favorable memories, or maybe disfavorable memories from campaigning? Yeah,
so it really started like when I was in high school. I would just volunteer for a local campaign, someone for running for local office. Sometimes it was someone that I knew, or a neighbor knew, or a friend of a friend. Just doing stuff like, dropping literature at doors, or door knocking, or answering the phone, or things like that. But by the time I was in college, I was ready for more. So really a great formative experience for me. I really lucked out here. My senior year in college was a presidential election year. And one of the candidates running that year was a little-known governor from the Mid-South named Bill Clinton. And I was really drawn to him for a lot of reasons, not important what they are, I suppose, but I was really drawn to him. So I organized my college campus for students for Clinton. Well, so that was my senior year. So by the spring, he had sewn up the national nomination. He had won enough delegates to be the Democratic Party nominee. And I was supposed to go to law school that fall, but I had no idea what I was going to do that summer between college graduation and starting law school. So I wrote letters, totally cold, talk about cold calling. I mean, I wrote letters, I had no contact, no connection, nothing. I just wrote blindly, like 5 letters, 6 letters, to people whose names I had read in the newspaper, who were associated with the campaign. I had no contact, I just sent them to the national headquarters, figuring, all right, I'm no worse off, right, for trying. And one of them called me back. And this was Governor Clinton's chief of staff for 7 or 8 years while he was governor, who was involved in this presidential campaign. And she said, come on down. And I pushed my luck, and I said, great. One of my best friends would like to do this too. Can you hire him too? And she basically said, all right, if it's a package deal, you can both come down. So we came down, and she said, drive on down to Little Rock, and they set us up in a furnished apartment, gave us a meal money stipend every week, I should say, and that was it. But we lived in Little Rock for 6 months, basically, and worked in Little Rock, Arkansas, on the Clinton-Gore campaign, and that was really a formative experience. So I deferred law school. There's no way I was leaving that campaign, and just when it was getting fun in August and September. Right. So I deferred law school, and I worked on this presidential campaign, which was really, really a cool experience. I highly recommend it, no matter what your political party is or anything like that. If you can work on a campaign like that, at that level, it's really fun.
Interesting, very, very interesting. I'd also like to know, there's a lot of challenges, I think we've previously stated, with elections in Minnesota, and we've briefly discussed those, but what are you and your office doing to solve those problems? Yeah, it's a few things.
There's a temptation to focus, and for good reason, on legislation and passing laws, because that's a big part of all of this, of course. So yesterday we rolled out a group of 6 legislative priorities. It's not the only things we'll be working on, but it's sort of the big 6 that we're going to really lean into. And they have to do with everything from what's called automatic voter registration, which would mean when you get your driver's license or renew a driver's license, you could be automatically registered to vote, and including other government interactions, that's one. Restoring the right to vote for people who have left prison behind. So they've done their time, they've paid their price, and now they're out, and I think it's high time we do that. And things like pre-registration for 16 and 17-year-olds, that includes many of you. That's something that many states have adopted now with great success. It doesn't mean necessarily registering, because you can't do that until you're 18. But if we pass this, that if you're 16 or 17, you could at least sign up to be in line, so that on your 18th birthday, boom, automatically you would be registered to vote, you'd be in the system, you wouldn't have to do anything else. And it's a really cool thing that can streamline the system and get people, thinking about elections. And I hope you all do when you turn 18, because I think that, if you vote that first election that you're eligible when you're 18, 19, 20 or whatever, there's a much higher chance that you're just going to make it a lifelong habit. And we can talk in a minute about why I think it's important that people vote. So that's one. But I want to talk just for a minute, even though we just unveiled these legislative proposals yesterday, not everything's about the legislature. There are things you can do to make the election system better that have nothing to do with passing a bill at the legislature. And let me give you a personal example, one that I'm personally proud of. One of the things we've done during my time in this job is we've more than doubled the number of languages that we serve, which this school ought to be more interested in than most. When I came in, it was 5 languages, now it's 12. So we do everything in elections in 12 different languages, including American Sign Language. And that's really important to me because I am the son of an immigrant. My mother was from Austria. I grew up in a bilingual household, which is why I think your mission here is so vital and important at this school. And I know what that's like. I grew up with that in my house. And once in a while I'll get people who push back a little bit, and I don't blame them. I don't think it's a bad thing. I'll get someone who will say this. They'll say, hey, Steve, why should we be printing any voting and election stuff in a language other than English? After all, you can only vote if you're a citizen. We all agree on that. And you can only become a citizen in almost every case if you've passed an English test. So by definition, why would you ever need any elections-related stuff in a language other than English? Right? It's a fair question. I have 2 responses to that. The first is personal. I grew up in a bilingual household, maybe some of you have as well. And I know this from my mother, that when it came to technical instructions, technical stuff, not conversational English, but technical instructions, I don't care whether it's the refrigerator manual or a government document. She wanted that stuff in her native language because she could better understand it. She spoke fluent English. That's not the point. The point is, it's just she was wired that way. So I get that. And then the second point I always make is really a historical one. Minnesota has been doing some version of this, which is translating election materials into other languages, since 1896. Not 1996, 1896. The only difference between what we're doing now and what we started doing over 120 years ago is the languages. Back then, as you might imagine, the languages that we translated stuff into in Minnesota were Swedish, Norwegian, Finnish, French, German, etc. Now, none of those languages are on the list. They've been replaced by Somali, Spanish, Hmong, etc., just to reflect our population. But that's it. It's no different from what we have been doing for 120 years. So that's an example of something that doesn't require a bill or a law. We just did it because we wanted to do it, and we saw a need, and we wanted to fill that need. So that's one example. And then the final thing I'll say is, honestly, visits like this, to persuade people who are not yet 18 about the importance of using their power, using their voice, to make themselves heard. And let me just say to all of you, let me hijack your question slightly. I have a strong opinion on this, and maybe you can tell. I think too often when people talk to you guys about voting, or people your age about voting, too many of the arguments are about sort of the good deed aspect of voting, like, oh, you should vote because it's the right thing to do, you should vote because people fought and bled and sometimes died for the right to vote, and those are true, absolutely true. We should never abandon those arguments. But here's the other reason to vote. It's in your own self-interest to vote. This is not a blood drive. This is not me and other people saying, oh, please, will you do this selfless act for someone you're never going to meet? Please, out of the kindness and charity of your heart. It's not that. It's do this thing that's good for you. You want to flex your muscle. You want to show your power. You want to use your voice. That's what you got to do, because communities that vote get attention. Right. However you define community, whether it's based on geography or demography or friendship or anything else. Communities that vote get attention, and they're more likely to get the outcomes that they want, whatever those are. So I have a lot more to say about that, and I've hijacked your question. But yes, the things that we do to perfect our election system, some of them are formal things by passing a law, right, and some of them are just things that we dream up and that we think to do because we can.
Mm-hmm. The thing you were saying about voting being in your own self-interest, so it's almost more of a thing that can really benefit you and projecting your ideals into Washington and even in the state.
Yeah,
right.
I mean, the way I look at it is this. In this country, when you turn 18 years old, you get a lot of things. Hopefully you get a present or two, you get some congratulations, you get some birthday cake, but you know what else you get, whether you ask for it or not? Formal political power. That's a birthday gift that every American citizen gets on age 18. You might not have asked for it or thought of it, but you get it. You have it, you own it. And when you own it, don't leave it on the table, because if you leave that on the table, like anything of value you leave on a table, someone's going to swipe it. Right. So you not voting is basically doubling the vote of someone who you disagree with on everything. And so don't do it. Flex that muscle, use your voice, use your power. That's what it is. And people will listen. They will pay attention.
Absolutely.
If you're a voter.
Let's see. I'd also like to know, I've been kind of curious about a lot of politicians. They have not gone to college. They don't have degrees. Maybe they've pursued some other career. Would you say that something like a political science degree or some sort of degree, would that be useful for politics, or is it not really necessary?
I have a strong opinion on this one, too. So I was in the Minnesota legislature, as I said, for 10 years. And thank goodness in Minnesota we have what's called a citizen legislature. Most states do. I think like 38 have what we have, and like only 12 have the other kind. So citizen legislature means our legislature is not a full-time, year-round job like it is in Congress, for example. So the session starts in early January. It goes till sometime in mid or late May, and then that's it. Then people go off and they do other things. They have other jobs or responsibilities. We have legislators that are in law enforcement, they're business owners, they're teachers, they're lawyers, they're farmers. One person who I got elected with, who's still there, who's a powerful committee chair now, when he was elected, he was a baggage handler at the MSP airport. The reason I mention that is, and you're not wrong to mention school or degrees or majors or things like that, but I just want everyone here to know that any one of you could do my job. Any one of you. And I haven't even met you yet. You may have no interest in doing my job. That's okay. But if you wanted to, you could do this job, and I haven't even met you yet. And I say that because though, of course, it's helpful to get certain kinds of degrees and maybe concentrate studies in a certain area, in Minnesota in particular, there is no one true path or route if you're interested in public service or elected office. So please don't let anyone tell you, and again, you may have no interest in what I do or being in this world at all, but if you are, and if you have that interest, don't let anyone tell you that there's one true path, and that if you don't go to a certain kind of school or major in a certain kind of subject or get a certain kind of degree that you're going to be out, because that is not true. If it ever was true, it really isn't true today. What you need to be in office, again, you may not be interested in that, but what you need are fundamentally two things. Some core values. You don't have to be an expert on everything. You're not a robot. Nobody expects you, if you run to office, to have a 10-point plan on each of 80 issues. Nobody expects that. But you need to have a core, some principles that guide you, and you need to be willing to work really, really hard in the campaign context to get elected. Those are the two core things. And where you went to school, or if you went to school, or what particularly you studied, at the margins those can be helpful. There are things that I've studied that I think have helped me in this job. But I wouldn't say that if you haven't studied what I studied, you're incapable of doing this job, or you wouldn't be qualified to do this job. So, like anything in life, the truth is somewhere in the middle, I'd say. So certain degree, I did what you might think is the conventional thing, right? I majored in political science, which I think is helpful, but not essential. I then went to law school. Do I find that the law degree helps me in this job? Sure, but there's someone who could do the job just as well or better than I, who maybe never had those things. So it just all depends. There's no one true path.
Well, I think that's definitely a really great perspective on that. Seeing as it is 2:06, I'm going to open up the floor to audience participation questions. So if anyone is wondering anything to ask the secretary, now would be the time.
I'll take questions or comments or advice or pushback or anything you got. Go ahead. What you can.
Just anyway.
Yeah.
don't think it's. Oh, it is. Hey, Mr. Simon. Over here.
Got it. Okay.
All right, I got one simple yes or no question for you. Have you ever been lobbied before?
Have I ever been lobbied before?
Yeah. You
Plenty,
have?
plenty of times, yeah.
All right, thank you.
So in case everyone's not familiar with what that is, to be lobbied, so when you're in the legislature in particular, but I'd say in this job too, but particularly in the legislature, there are people called lobbyists, which are basically paid advocates for a particular cause or organization. So they could be on behalf of teachers or farmers or business owners or students or anyone. And typically to be a lobbyist means you're paid to do that. You're paid to go to the Capitol or wherever and advocate for or against things. And lobbyists often, regularly, meet with legislators to say, hey, you should really vote for this particular bill, or you should definitely not vote for this particular bill, or do something or the other, and the legislator can listen and agree or listen and disagree. So yeah, when you're in the legislature in particular, it's a big part of the job to listen to these folks who represent often very important groups. And that's that group's voice at the Capitol. Not everyone can take off work or take off school and just show up at state capitals. And so they pool their resources and they hire someone to be their voice. And those people more often than not deserve respect, not agreement necessarily, but respect. So yes, I've been lobbied many, many times.
All right, and then we've got time for one more question from the audience.
Can you hear me? Oh. Hi. I'm Simon. I'm Gabe. This is a pretty casual question, but do you have family?
I do.
Yep. I'm wondering is, what do you do in your free time? Just
So,
like,
Believe me, I have 2 little kids. They take up a lot of free time. My wife Leah and I live with our 2 kids. Hannah just turned 10, and Noah is 8, and we have 2 dogs and 3 cats. So more pets than kids.
my mother.
Twice as many pets, more than twice as many pets as kids. So they all take up a lot of my time, which is fine, doing their activities, their sports, weekend things, all the rest. So that's a big chunk of my non-office life for sure.
My mother's name's Leah as well.
Skylar, is there time for one more?
I think we do have time for one more.
All right, hi. My question was, do you have any specific examples of things you or your department have done that may affect us as kind of a whole youth type thing?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. So, I like to say that we're in the democracy business, so one of the things we do often is reach out to students when it comes to voting. And I've given you some of the arguments and some of the angles on that, but one of the things that I'm really proud that we do, and I can't remember whether your school has been a participant, but one of the things we started when I came into office was Minnesota's first ever mock election for high school students. So we made it real simple, and we said we're going to have just one office on the ballot, either governor or president, depending on the year, and we're going to get schools to participate in this mock election statewide, and then we're going to publish the results so that people can go on and see which schools voted which way, and we'll do a whole map of Minnesota. So we've been doing that since 2016, and that's been a great way, I hope, we hear, to get young people into elections before they're even eligible to vote. Just that feeling of casting a ballot and having it matter in a sense. It's not an official ballot, obviously, but it looks like one, exactly. And just getting in that habit of filling in that oval and making your voice heard. So that's something that's one example of something that could directly affect you if the school is a participant, and I can't remember whether it has been or not. I hope you are in the next election in 2024, but that's one example I would bring up.
Absolutely. Well, seeing as it is 2:12, I really wish we did have more time, but on behalf of all the students and staff here at LILA, I want to deeply thank you for this amazing opportunity that you've presented us with.
Thank you. Thanks, Skylar. Thank you. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Really good of you.